Well, hello everyone. This is Al Fadi, and I want to welcome you to a brand new video series concerning various historical issues that deals with Islam and its origin. And this particular video series we're going to title the Qibla Dilemma: Data versus Interpretation. And if you've been following our video series on this topic in the past with Dr. J. Smith, you know that we have addressed a number of those contradictions between the standard Islamic narrative concerning the change of Qibla direction, the change of the prayer direction, supposedly or allegedly, from towards Jerusalem back towards Mecca, and it happened at a certain period of time according to the Quran. However, our dear brother, a researcher and archaeologist, Dan Gibson, uncovered a lot of data that contradicts this particular narrative. And of course, having said that, no better than Dan Gibson himself can really unpack this contradiction or this tension, let's call it, between the data and the interpretation. And as a result of this, we've invited Dan to join us virtually, and he graciously agreed to do that. So, brother, thank you so much. It's an honor really to have you here with us virtually, and hopefully soon we will have you in person to unpack these fascinating discoveries. I remember the first time I met you in Canada, I was at a conference, former Muslims. You approached me from behind, you tapped me on the shoulder, and you gave me a book called the Quranic Geography. And I looked at the book, and I really didn't know what to make out of it at that point. Then I looked through it, and I says, gee, I wonder where he got his data from. And then the more I explored it and the more I start to hear about your research, the more Jay Smith brought it up to my attention, the more I dug deeper. It was so fascinating that there is rich amount of data available for our Muslim friends to see for themselves, just using the Quran alone versus factual data, that there is a problem. And this problem is definitely damaging to that standard Islamic narrative. So thank you again for being here with us.
So thank you, Al Fadi. It's good to be here. Yes, thank you for that introduction. I am a historian, and my interest has always been in the history of the Middle East for as long as I can remember. And I was living in Jordan back in the 1970s, late 1970s, studying Arabic at that time. And I was challenged by some Muslim friends to read the Quran. And I began to check out some of the locations because geography was kind of new. I was just beginning my 20s at the very early age. And I read through, started reading through the Quran and tried to figure out where things were. And I also was reading hadiths and histories and so forth, and making myself acquainted with the geography of the Middle East. As somebody growing up in Canada, I didn't know where a lot of places were. I had to figure things out. And I remember actually a few years after that reading through Ibn Ishaq's his story of the biography of Muhammad, and I recognized that it seemed to be talking about Northern Arabia rather than Central Arabia, and that was always in the back of my mind. So I then began checking mosque Qiblas. And that's the direction that the mosque faces. In every mosque, as you know, that when people pray, they line up and they face all towards one wall of that mosque. It's called the Qibla wall. And every mosque has an orientation. It's oriented towards the focus where Muslims are supposed to pray. And every Muslim that I had ever met said that faces towards Mecca, and that faces towards something in Mecca called Masjid al-Haram, and that is the holy place that's there. And in that holy place is the Kaaba, and in that Kaaba is a black stone. So they're facing all of those directions when they face their Qibla direction, and so that's always before them. But I noticed that there were mosques that didn't face towards Mecca. And I would ask, and some people say, oh, that faces towards Jerusalem, or some things like that. So I began to make a list of early mosques and began checking them. And I've got a slide here, slide number 1, if we can put that up. In the end of doing my research, this is the number of mosques that I ended up looking at. And I started looking at that mess, but I began to realize there were patterns in the way mosques were facing. And I wanted to unravel that. And I eventually began to look at it and say, I think I can see 3 patterns that were existing. There were mosques that were facing towards Mecca and Saudi Arabia, but there were mosques that faced in all kinds of other directions. And so I started building this database. If we can jump to, I think it's slide 4, that will bring us up to the database. And I started listing the mosques, and my list was limited to the first 3 centuries of Islam. To do all of Islam would be a huge job. There are thousands and thousands of mosques out there. But I wanted to know about the very earliest mosques, and I wanted to see them done in a pattern from the earliest moving on until through the first 3 centuries. And I began to look and realize there's something there that was different. And during this time, we made a film called the Sacred City. So maybe we can bring up the slide. Sorry, I should have my numbers in front of me. Slide 3. In that film, The Sacred City, we talked about 19 mosques in the film. And there were 13 that were facing, I felt, towards the city of Petra. That is, if you took Petra and then drew a line around it, maybe measured out 100 kilometers on either side and then drew a line around it, these all fit within that circle. And there were 2 that I had that were facing towards Mecca, and there were 4 that faced between the 2. They just sort of went right down to an area right between the 2. And so there were 19 mosques in that film. And so people had watched it, and I encouraged people to watch it, and people started writing back to me, and we began adding more and more things to the list as we went along. So eventually, that database grew to over 100 mosques, that's surviving mosques from the first 3 centuries of Islam. These are not just mosques that you can go and look at, because there are many that are there that people say, oh yeah, this is an early mosque. But when you go to the site, the mosque maybe was built in 1985. They bulldozed everything down and built a new mosque.
Right.
And maybe that happened 4, 5, 6 times through the last 1,000 and 1,500 years. And so I looked at those, said, well, I'll put them in the database, but they're in as unknown. And so out of the 100 that we have, there's actually 160 about in the first 3 centuries, but 60 of them have been so badly damaged and rebuilt and changed that we can't actually measure what it looked like in the first centuries of Islam. So we then come up with this is, I think it's slide 4, that will show us the surviving mosques, and they have 4 different Qiblas that come up. Right. So I've make sure we got the right one up. And now there were 4 very distinct areas. I gave them names. Now they're my names. I assigned them names. But whether I signed them right or wrong is another discussion. I felt that there were 4 distinct different Qiblas. And the very first one, or the earliest Qiblas, I call the Petra Qibla, because that was right at the center of the circle that where all these mosques seem to be facing. The earliest one was in 5 after the Hijrah, and there are 36 mosques over that first 200 years that faced Petra that we have. We can go back and record. These are mosques that survived, and we can look at them, and there they are. So there were 36 that we have up to date. Then there is those mosques in North Africa. I call these the parallel ones because or sometimes I call them an African mosque. If you hear me, African Qibla. If I'm talking about an African Qibla, it's all the same thing. In the first 300 years of Islamic history, there are 15 that survive that we can look at. There are many more that come that we can look at that come in the 4th century, in the 5th century, and so forth. So, and those began in 58 after the Hijrah. There were none before that. So we can go back and look at the dates. Say the earliest one comes from about 58 after the Hijrah. There then started to what I call the between Qiblas, and that started in 87 after the Hijrah. And in that first 3 centuries of Islamic history, 36 mosques were built, many of these major mosques that faced what I call the between position. I have reasons for calling it the between Qibla, the between position. And then at 109 after the Hijrah, this is more than a century after the first beginning, after the Hijrah of Islam, there started to be mosques facing Mecca. Now, maybe there's some before 109 that didn't survive, and so I haven't been able to find them or have been so totally rebuilt that we can't measure them. But we have 19 mosques only that face in that period of time.
Now, if I may comment.
Go ahead. That's the overall data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting, of course, this particular slide that everybody's watching right now, because I have done this show a couple of times before with Jay, and I'm familiar with your, data in terms of what you mean by the Petra Qibla, by the parallel Qibla, by the between Qibla and the Mecca. I want to give people a quick overview here because I want to make a comment. The Petra Qibla, obviously facing Petra. Parallel was between Petra and Mecca. North Africa, parallel to the direction of, between Petra and Mecca. Between Qibla, it's directed to something between Mecca and Petra. And finally, the Mecca, it's as the name says, facing Mecca. It's kind of interesting because it puts a different spin on the traditional or narrative of Islam, because it seemed like the spread of knowledge about prayer, at least, and the Qibla started from Petra, went to North Africa, and then went east to what we call the Abbasides, basically a dynasty, and then went south from there to Mecca. So I just want people to be aware of that. If we use this data and use the dating of these mosques, it seemed like the Islam started it somewhere different than Mecca, because you would expect it to start in Mecca, meaning the earliest, it should be in Mecca, making its way up north to Petra versus the opposite.
That's right. Let's put up slide number 5, and this is the mosques that face towards Petra, and they're from north, south, east, and west. And so these all from these various directions are all facing towards Petra. This is what I didn't expect, because these are the earliest mosques. These are from the very first century of Islam.
Right.
This just. It just totally contradicted. I couldn't believe it when I found it. It's still amazing to look at because it contradicts absolutely everything that every Muslim has told me or that I've read in all the Islamic literature. Petra's not mentioned anywhere. And so that becomes a problem. How and why are these mosques facing in this direction?
Right.
Okay, so if we bring up the next slide, which is 6 of, I think we're going to 6. Oh, my pictures are all backwards. Okay, sorry.
No problem.
There we go. 6 is the ones pointing to Mecca. There are a few that are pointing to Mecca. There's 19 in that first 300 years. So, and the first 100 years, nothing. And then in the next 200 years, there are only 19 surviving mosques.
And then facing Mecca.
Facing Mecca.
Years,
and then if we go
Mecca.
Go to slide 7, then we see this is very strange. Why are there so many mosques that face between Petra and Mecca?
Correct.
And so this data was very startling. Now, what happens is that this is the data. This is what we need to give an answer for. We need to come up with some reason why these mosques face in these directions. What I find interesting is that there are no erroneous mosques. They're not mosques just pointing off in some random direction. They all fit the pattern of these four different Qibla directions.
Right.
So we need to come up with an explanation. And when I come up with an explanation, lots of people have arguments, and that's fine. But there's a difference between what the data says and what the theories are going to say about why this occurs.
That's right.
So we're going to end up talking about theories, and if people want to shoot down my theory of why this occurs, I'm fine. We can discuss that. They may have their reasons, but we also need to go back and say, so then what does this mean? If my interpretation, it doesn't satisfy you, then please come up with your own interpretation of what is going on here.
Absolutely. And that will be, of course, for the second part of this particular video series, where we're going to talk about the data versus the interpretation. And I want to say this, Dan, maybe the comparison I'm going to use may not be as equivalent to this. But, you know, I watch a lot of crime investigations, and there is something called DNA. Whenever you have a DNA, it is very hard for anyone to dispute against it. It's a fact. It's the data. DNA says you were here at this location. You can come up with any excuses why you weren't there, but the DNA disputes your argument. Same thing we're doing here. You have DNA is pointing the Qibla toward different locations, multiple mosques. You're not saying one mosque was towards Petra, one towards Mecca. No, we're talking a lot of mosques, which means that there is repetition of results. There is more data that are adding to the findings. And like you stated it clearly, we don't need attacks. You're actually welcoming anyone to challenge it scientifically and prove or disprove. I mean, the idea here, you don't feel like you own it. You're just putting it out there for people to do something about. We need to understand, for instance, when I look at something called the between Qibla, what was between Petra and Mecca? Was there a shrine there? Was there an eye? I mean, I have to understand why. It's not a coincidence that it was pointing to that direction, not one by mistake, not two. We're talking 36 mosques. I mean, there has to be an explanation, obviously, for all of that.
That's 36 from the first three centuries. There are many more after that.
Right.
We're going to get into that discussion.
Wonderful.
In a later video of what that is. We're only dealing here in this video with the first 3 centuries of Islam.
Yep. Thank you, and for pointing that out. And thank you, everyone, of course, for joining us. And hopefully you find this particular video to be exciting. And I'm pretty sure the next one, part 2 of this particular discussion that we called Qibla Dilemma, Data versus Interpretation. And we gave right now, or laid out at least the introduction to the data collection. And now in part 2 of this particular series, we're going to talk now about the comparison between the data and the interpretation. And at least in this case, we're talking about Dan Gibson's interpretation. So let's keep in mind, when you are a researcher or a scientist, you're entitled really to reach your own conclusions. And people tend to attack these conclusions without doing their own counter research. And that's what we're trying to point out here. Do your counter research, present your data, argue it from a scientific standpoint, and that's okay. Let's put it out in a public arena for others to examine. Brother, thank you so much, as always. And please, go ahead, finish your thought. I think you have...
I just wanted to know if we have time to do just 2 quick questions.
Absolutely,
Some
please.
Of the questions people have is, how do you check a mosque? And so if we look at slide 9, what we do is I looked at archaeological reports, because archaeologists have already visited these places, they've measured, they've taken pictures, they've got diagrams. I can go by the studies that archaeologists have already made. I also used satellite, visiting is the best way.
Of course.
And many mosques you have to actually go to and visit. And I visited many of these mosques, and right right now, there are several other scholars who are working alongside. I'm collaborating with them. Right now, as we speak, there is one in the Middle East. He's got a whole list of different mosques that he is going to and visiting on the ground and doing the checks there because we were having trouble from satellite photos, which is the other one we use to look down at. And sometimes if a new mosque has been built on top of a second one, so it's on the second floor, you can't see that original mosque. So
Correct.
It needs a visit, someone to go there and actually do the measurement. So that's how we got the data. And on the next slide, slide 10, question is, how do you date a mosque? Because how do I know it's in the first 3 centuries of Islam? So again, we go back to archaeological reports. Many of these archaeologists have visited, they've made reports. Some of it depends on the pottery that's found there. People check, there's pottery, can be easily dated. Coins, ancient coins found in an excavation, help them date. Mortar is the stuff put between stones. And so they mix up mortar with some gravel, and who knows what's in that mortar. And so often they take the mortar and look to see that's where you find sometimes the pottery and the stones, and you can date, hey, this is when that mosque was built, that pottery and those coins were lying around here. And then there's ancient manuscripts. There are lots of times we're reading the histories, and it tells us that the army reached this point on this date, and so we know, okay, the Muslims arrive, and this help us date, especially if it says, and they built a mosque. And some mosques are actually dated because they're mentioned in ancient manuscripts. So we have done careful study of this, and So the data is there, and I challenge people, if you don't like the way we measured a mosque, please go and measure it again and come back to us. We are willing to reconsider and look at each individual mosque and have it dated, but there are other archaeologists who are looking at that. And so this data is actually have other people, peers of mine who are checking, people with degrees in archaeology, people with degrees in statistics are looking and checking at data. And that's the important thing. We want this data to be trustworthy.
Absolutely. And I'm thankful that at least your research has prompted some of this interest. And I pray and hope that many of these researchers, archaeologists, statisticians, or others will benefit at least from what you have done. Whether their findings will corroborate or not, it's irrelevant. The idea is that's what the field of research is all about. We help one another. And yes, there is a way to critique someone else's research, but we need to keep it also in a civil fashion. We need to just build upon each other's research and correct one another if necessary, based on facts, data, and findings. So thank you, brother, for your time. And of course, next episode, we are going to begin to address the topic of data and the tension between the data and the interpretation. Until then, have a blessed day, everyone. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, S.I.N International, and click on the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or go live. I would also like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking the link right below. By doing so, you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you where you can give to our channel. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.